Hello everybody, my name's Jamie Bartram. I direct the Water Institute here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'd like to welcome you to this live webcast panel discussion on community management of water systems, collaboratively between the Water Institute and the Rural Water Supply Network. Here at UNC, we're in day 2 of our annual conference on water and health where science meets policy, and we have a group of people assembled in the room for an early start for this panel. And looking at the online ticker, we see people linking in to the online webcast. Sorry, we're just doing some technical corrections here. There we go. The background to this webcast begins with the WASH Policy Research Digest that was started in 2015 with the generous support of Signe Hansen, and has tackled issues such as water tariffs, sanitation subsidies, and monitoring of hand pump functionality. The digest is intended to be a very brief and succinct form of information that's written to be especially relevant for policymakers and those involved in program management and delivery. It's free to download, and I'd like to encourage people to look at the various editions that are available. In 2016, we identified community management as a theme of concern that we thought would be appropriate for a digest, and approached RWSN to explore their interest in collaborating on that. That was extremely timely because they just held their 7th forum in Abidjan, and after discussion we identified a specific paper to be part of the focus of the digest that had been written by Ellie Chowns. We agreed to focus on that, and the format of all of these digests is a focus on a single paper that we think gives important insights and to give an overall review of the subject. I'm really encouraged to see how many people we have here physically in the room, and the number of people who are dialing in to the webcast. And I'd like to hand you across to Clarissa Brocklehurst, who's an affiliate of the Water Institute and an adjunct professor here at the University of North Carolina, and who plays a leading role in the management and delivery of the digests. Clarissa.
Thanks very much, Jamie. It's really great to be here, to know that we've got quite a lot of online participants, but particularly that we've got a lot of brave people who got up very early in the morning here in Chapel Hill to be here. You're all looking people in the room are all looking very bright and eager. So it's a real delight. I have a panel with me in person up here, and then one panelist online. So what I'll do is I'll introduce them. We have Aaron Kabirizi here, who's a director at the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. We have Harold Lockwood, who's with Aguaconsult in the UK. We have Vida Dutti, who is the country director for Ghana for IRC. And online we have Ellie Chowns, who is an evaluation and research specialist at VSO. And for the people who are in the room, you can see her smiling face up on the screen behind me. So what I'm going to do is dive right in with a few questions to each one of our panelists. And while I'm doing that, I'm hoping that the audience here in the room and online will start thinking of questions that they want to ask the panelists. And we've got somebody who is monitoring the Q&A box that for the online participants you can see at the bottom of your screen. So please start putting questions into that box, and they'll get relayed to me by our online host David Fuente, who's sitting in front of me. So I want to start with Ellie. I want to go to Ellie because Ellie's original paper was the one that started this whole discussion, this whole lively discussion. And your original paper, Ellie, started it by asking whether community management of rural water supplies was a viable option. So I'd like you to just briefly state your position and be as provocative as you like, because it was being provocative that got the whole conversation started in the first place. So Ellie, would you like to speak a bit about what your paper said?
Sure, okay, thank you very much, Clarissa, and thanks everyone involved in this session. It's great to be part of it. My paper was based on my PhD research in Malawi in 2011 and 2012, and that PhD grew out of I'd spent more than 10 years working for NGOs, and I had these questions really about the sustainability of development programs, and water programs were a good kind of case study for that. So that was the root of this, a question really about sustainability. And what I did was I looked at how the community management model worked in 4 districts, high and low functionality districts, a total of 24 locations with randomly sampled water points. And I collected data from hundreds, over 300 water points I observed and did surveys at myself, interviews and in-depth surveys done by a local research assistant as well. And I concluded basically that community management does not work well for communities. And I think that statement has provoked a lot of debate within the sector because it's seen as a very bold statement. So I want to explain why I've come to that conclusion. I think community management doesn't work well in 2 ways. It fails on both efficiency and empowerment grounds. So in theory, community management is supposed to help ensure sustainability by making sure that users conduct regular preventive maintenance, that they make rapid, high-quality repairs, they collect and save funds. But I found that all of those assumptions do not hold. So we found evidence of preventive maintenance only in, good evidence of preventive maintenance only in 2 out of 338 water points. Repairs, very often slow and substandard. Many people said to me, we were trained, but really we have no skills. And real problems with the finance model. So I looked in depth at 30 water points and found that on average, they had only collected 2% of the amount that they themselves had expected to collect. So real problems. But I think the thing that my research adds in particular to the debate, because those critiques have been made for, let's face it, 2 or 3 decades, the point that I'd particularly like to emphasize is that community management fails on empowerment grounds as well. I found it actually doesn't challenge inequality. In fact, it reinforces existing inequalities, dynamics within communities. It breeds conflict instead of building social capital. So we found evidence of lots of conflict, particularly over money management within communities. And really both users and water point managers, committee members, both sides really felt disempowered by the process. So overall, I think that community management really provides a bit of a fig leaf for state and donor failure, and it allows them to abdicate responsibility for long-term service provision and place that responsibility on the shoulders of people who have the least capacity to carry it, really, the users. Is that enough to start with?
Oh, I like the fig leaf. Thank you. Fig leaf's always a good provocative statement. Thank you very much, Ellie. That gets us really well into the discussion. So what I thought I'd do now is ask Harold to come in here. He's just completed a global assessment of rural water supply delivery models. And he's also looked at the whole issue of community management. So Harold, what do you have any fig leaves of your own?
Several hiding in the closet, but that's for another discussion. It's true, we did just come off the back of a big bank study, 16 countries. And in fact, there is going to be a presentation on that, I think, on Thursday afternoon here. So if you want to know more details, that would be a good thing to go along and see. I guess first thing I would say is, and I think it speaks a lot to what Ellie just has articulated, is this is very, very, by no means the first time we've been having this kind of discussion. The doubts, the questionings about the viability of community management as an approach have been ongoing for quite some considerable time. So I think we should remember that this is not something that's just popped up out of the blue. For a long time, there's been a discussion around this. And it's good to revisit it, and it's good with new evidence to stimulate the discussion. So thanks to Ellie for kicking that off. In terms of the study, I think 3 main takeaways that I would sort of throw into the pot. One is that from that study, we found on the positive side, that community-based management can be a viable model, a viable service delivery model, when the conditions are right. And I think we're all probably familiar with what those type of conditions are around adequate support, trying to tackle the question of financing, and better professionalization of capacity in terms of the operators. So it can be successful, but we also found an awful lot of challenges, an awful lot of failures around community management as a service delivery model. It was present in all 16 countries, all the way along the spectrum, including the wealthier countries, and that's an important point to note, and I'll come back to that in a second comment. And we found some quite positive examples, particularly where community management is federated or associations are built up, so you get a tiered level of support between and above the communities. And we saw that in Brazil and in Tanzania, and you can see the details of that in the various documents. So that's the first thing. So it can be viable, but only under certain conditions. Secondly, and I think we take a step backwards and look up a bit in terms of the broader context in which community-based management operates. You know, we're in the 21st century, rural populations are not monolithic, certainly not globally, but not even within a country. So you're dealing with populations with varying GDP or GNI per capita from the mid-hundreds all the way up to the thousands and even tens of thousands in some of the countries we looked at in this study. And that provides a lot of different challenges, different opportunities in terms of what's possible. And expectations from people themselves. You know, people know what a good service is. They're increasingly interconnected through mobile technology. So we can't think of it as a monolithic sector. And the onus is then on us in terms of policymakers and practitioners to try and create the conditions, very much government, so it'd be good to hear from Aaron on this, to allow those different types of models to exist through legislation, through regulation and so on. Lastly, the third point I'd say is linked to that is that the study really showed us that community-based management should be considered as one of a range of options. So thinking about those different types of populations, you have people in very dispersed areas which some form of supported self-supply can be considered. You have people in communities where community-based management can still work, but with those conditions met. And then moving all the way over to the sort of more concentrated areas, people living near cities. We saw examples of urban utilities starting to draw in rural populations, connect them up to the networks and deliver pretty much 24/7 water. Aggregated management is another model that's emerging where a number of systems are connected either physically or under an umbrella management contract. But they still need some way of addressing those more isolated communities. So in some of the provinces in China, for example, utilities serving millions of people, but also a large number of people needing to be supported within the same area. So I think it's that multiplicity of answers that we need to look for.
Okay, thank you very much. So as you've mentioned, it'd be interesting to hear what Aaron's perspective is. You're a government official working within a government ministry that is trying to ensure rural water supply access. What's your perspective on the question of community management?
Thank you, Clarissa. First of all, I have to thank Ellie for that provocative statement. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk from a government perspective. So quickly, I would say that let the discussion continue. Why? Because governments all over will only start or scale up systems or models that have been tried. I mean, you will not ask the Uganda government to start something, scale it up everywhere when it hasn't been proven. So, but also I must say that government and Uganda government, research is the weakest link in the chain. The budget for research will always be cut out at the earliest whenever priorities have to be reorganized. So this is a good thing that somebody is talking about it, somebody has brought it up, and probably solutions will come. But having said that, usually when such discussions are going on, we know where we are. We also know where we're going, but we need to address the transition. And that's, I think, where Harold comes in handy, that community management can work, and it will continue working for some time. Of course, having said that it doesn't work, should be probably abandoned, but governments will not do that. I mean, I spent several years working in government, the first 15 years, working on community management, designing it and trying to get things working. And I just want to tell the community, I mean the audience here and everywhere, that we in Uganda, we attribute the 86% functionality to this community management that is not working as well. The good elements, where I probably will disagree with Ellie, is that it doesn't empower communities. To me, that's the strong point. It really empowers communities. You see, in the rural areas, there are two things. What they have most is themselves. What they have least is cash. And if we can, try to get as much as possible for what the communities have, because in the rural Uganda, cash is really, the priorities are many: health, education, what. So I know people now moving on, they wouldn't want to come and you call a drum and call people to come around and repair a source. But I think with all people in the world, universities can do research to harness what the communities have most. So to me, I think empowerment, I'll need to listen a little more. Something good, it really leverages what the communities have most, that is themselves. Now, what is our experience? I told you that we have 86% of our rural water sources working, courtesy, really attributed to community management. If I had time, I would tell you how we designed it. But in brief, we designed community management around 3 tiers. 1 is the communities themselves, 2, the artisans, and then 3, the backup support. Now, if we are going to address community management, ladies and gentlemen, I want us to unpack community management. And I think everybody, including Ellie, has attempted to do that. There are elements that are not working, but the whole statement that's not working, I think is a bit heavy on us. But so fast forward, what needs to be done? To me, we unpack community management. We unpack this society. I think Harold or Ellie has said that communities are not homogeneous, not any longer. I mean, there are people who are working, there are people who are farmers, there are people. So when we unpack and we get to know what the interests are, what we expect, then we can probably design something along those lines. And then I think we offer options. You know, for all the time I've worked, people tended to think that rural areas, they have one size suits them all. They also want options. I mean, even if you go to rural Uganda, you'll find mobile phone, they use Airtel, others will go to MTN. They want choices. That's where I come to what we are trying to do. What we are trying to do is we are rethinking community management, looking at the elements that are not working. And as I said, we are weak at doing research. We are working with a number of organizations that are trying to address And if you listen to some of the presentations that are going to come, you will see that they are really trying to address the whole global community management, but looking at certain elements within that. So to me, community management works.
Excellent, thank you. Very nice. Okay, so we've laid out a couple of points of view here. Glass half full, glass half empty. Vida, would you like to come in? You work with IRC that has a passionate interest in rural water supply sustainability. What's your perspective?
Thank you, Carissa. IRC, in the work that we have done, we've also done a lot of studies, researching the underlying causes and what could be done to improve on sustainability. In most of our studies, we've looked at the functionality, service levels, and performance of the management committees that we put in place. Most of the issues that have been outlined by Ellie in terms of the failure, we also found in our study. So I will not repeat those. But I also like to be a bit provocative in throwing back the issue to us and asking the question, whose failure are we talking about here? Because we seem to think that the communities failed, the mechanisms are not working. But then if you also look at the whole concept, it is premised on a number of assumptions. Assumptions of providing post-construction support, assumptions of having strong local government to be there to support the local communities. In most cases, hiding behind community ownership and management, we go to these communities, we support them with the facilities, we cut the tape, we have all the fanfare, and then we leave everything to these communities to struggle on their own. So as we reflect on community management, I think as practitioners, we should also be asking ourselves, have we been there to support the communities when they needed us most? Yes, they were supposed to put in structures for financial management. Did the officials go back to do the audits? Because if you put in the structures for financial management and there's no strong oversight, definitely if the funds are embezzled, there'll be conflict in the society. So we should also be asking ourselves, which aspects did we also fail? Because we shouldn't think that once we put in the committee, provide 1 week full training, we go to school for 5-7 years to become engineers. And then we hand over these systems to these communities, give them 1-2 weeks training, and expect them to be able to manage these complex systems. We said we put in a committee of 6, finance, and they are supposed to handle all the complexities. We go to school to become accountants. We are able to keep the records very well. So as we discuss these things, we should also understand that the failure that we see could also be because of system failure and us not being there to provide the support that is most needed to get the communities going. So we should also be looking at that from that angle. That said, I must say that it is good that we are now interrogating the whole concept of community ownership and management because the sector is changing. If I pick Ghana as an example, we see increasing changes happening at the bigger sector level. The economy has changed, it's become a lower middle income country. Demands for higher order of services are coming up. So we have to rethink of what kind of service. So you cannot continue with the boreholes that we have. People are asking for water on their home and their on premises. So we need to look at different mechanisms for providing that service to them. You also realize that urbanization is increasing very fast. So more people are becoming urbanized, more people are becoming exposed to higher order of service and are requesting for that higher order of service. What we also realize happening as part of the changing dynamics is that new partners are coming into the terrain. You have the private sector coming into the business, and where do you fit private sector alongside community ownership and management? So because of these changing dynamics, and also the new SDGs that was just approved, requires of us to go a little bit higher than what we have had in the past. It is driving the need to rethink the whole community management and look at packaging different models that will suit different segments of population. So for me, community management, saying that it has failed, I think if we have more than 70% of our systems working, we should be asking ourselves what contributed to that success and what do we do with the 30% failure, and then be able to unpack which areas require strengthening and how to move it forward. But definitely with the changing dynamics in the sector, we need to begin to rethink and see how we can build on the gains, and where we have not done very well, look at restructuring some aspects of how we have delivered rural water services.
Thanks, Vida. Thank you very much. So I'm hearing a pretty clear consensus from the panelists that are here in person that community management isn't perfect, but it's been a step along the way, but that we need to unpack it, rethink it, and look at the types of support that it needs. What I'm going to do now is, there may be people in the room who have questions. If you do, start waving. We don't have any online questions, but if online participants want to ask a question, just pop it into the Q&A box, and David will pick it up. Before I go to the audience that it's in person here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to Ellie and let her come back. And perhaps I'd also like to think about if the clear consensus is that community management has a chance of working if it's supported, what are the key types of support that the panelists here and Ellie online think are needed? So I'm going to ask you, Ellie, to give a very, very short comeback, and particularly about, from your research, what type of support you think would make the difference.
Okay, thank you. I think there's actually quite a diversity of opinions on this panel, and I think I probably am more at the end of the spectrum of community management really has fundamental problems, and its applicability needs to be really quite seriously reconsidered. I think that okay, so in my research, I suggested a couple of things. So one of them is, in terms of practical way forwards, funders should pay for performance, not for installations. That is, to me, a really obvious point. I've made the point that community management works better for donors and for governments, because they can kind of wash their hands of the ongoing service provision responsibility. If the financial incentives were set up to ensure that performance was the basis on which installers were paid, I think we'd see improvement. A key point that I wanted to make about what contributes to success, just following up on what Vida was saying, good engineering, actually. I found massive variation, I'm not an engineer, but massive variation in the quality of the installations. And it was very clear that good engineering at the start of service provision makes an enormous difference to whether it's continuing. We found many water points that were still working, even 10 years later, having had no breakdowns whatsoever. And so that if you want to make community management work, that's where you start, by ensuring that you don't place too much of a management and repair burden on the community in the first place. But I actually think that we should abandon water point committees. I think they don't work anyway. I think people abandon them. So I would hesitate to draw conclusions about Uganda, because my experience working in Uganda is not related to water. But certainly in Malawi, the problems that Vida talked about with non-functioning committees are very, very widespread. And to be honest, it doesn't make sense to train 6 or 10 people to manage every water point. It would be better, I think, to invest more in the professionalisation of the maintenance and repair service, so that users have responsibility perhaps for reporting breakdowns and problems, but not for being the first sort of port of call for fixing them. And I also think that user fees are unhelpful. I know that Clarissa and David, you picked up on this in your policy brief, but I think there's good evidence that for public goods, public health goods, user fees are very unhelpful. And I think water is an area where we should fix the provision of the service first, and then tackle the financial management cost recovery aspect later, once everyone has basic service.
Thanks, Ellie. That certainly caused a frisson of reaction in the room here. I can't tell about the online participants. We've only got half an hour, and I don't think that's nearly enough to discuss the implications. But thank you very much for that very, very succinct reply. I know of 2 questions that have come in electronically. I'll tell the panel what they are, and then perhaps I'll see if there's a question or 2 among the online audience. One question that came in from Sean Fury, who you can see here down at the bottom of the screen there, was whether the panel thinks that community management is a good vehicle for the realization of the human right to safe drinking water. And then there was another one that came in online to do with the psychological motivation for users in community management, by which I think I'm interpreting this question a bit. I think is to do with incentives, to how everybody is incentivized within the structure. So while you think about that, is there a question? Yes, okay, I can see Lewis at the back. I don't know, Jordan, can the online part? So you tell me the question, and then I completely change it and read it back.
Jamie is here. This is a terrific format. So doing more things in this way at the conference would be great to get a diversity of opinions out and a good discussion on it. Second, I guess both of these questions, 2 questions are maybe mostly to Harold. Is there good evidence that there's preventive maintenance from the community management system? Because I think preventive maintenance is a pretty good indicator of the likelihood that things are sustainable. And then I'd love to the panel's views on the point Ellie raised on that funders are part of the problem because they continue to pay for hardware. When I was in Uganda a couple of times in the last couple of years, and I kept wondering what would happen if the donors said, I want to pay for 15 or 20 years of performance. I want to pay for 15 or 20 years of continued water service in this community as opposed to paying for a well. I think you would get radically different responses to the system.
Thanks, Lewis. I'll relay that question because I think that the online participants couldn't hear you. So first, Lewis said some nice polite things about this format. Thank you very much. And that he was enjoying the discussion. Then he asked whether there was good evidence that there's preventive maintenance going on. And then he picked up on the point that I think Vida had made, which is that the funders are part of the problem because they fund hardware, and raised the question, what would happen if funders actually paid for 15 to 20 years of performance rather than the initial hardware? So that's 3 questions. Anybody got a burning question that they want to ask before I turn to the audience? Is it a nice short question?
Very
yes?
Short question.
Thank you.
The very provocative mention of no user fees.
Yeah.
The question I have is, do we understand what the default is when there are no user fees? There are currently no effective user fees at the moment in rural Uganda. People are not paying. We have serious breakdown. And then we have an alternative coming up very fast, which is people paying around between about $4 and $10 a month per household for water. That's the default situation at the moment. My name's Adam Harvey. I'm from Wade. I work in Uganda. We have a service company. And we do have 100% functionality with preventive maintenance systems that do work. So that's another answer to a question that just came up. But the question I have is, do we understand what the default is if we leave the situation to a default business arrangement? It's much more expensive, and it answers Sean Fury's question about what happens without community management. You may get no access by the pool. You may not satisfy universal access by the pool.
So are you asking the question or answering it? All right, so you're asking what happens when if you have no user fees. Yeah, all right, so some very interesting questions there. Who'd like to go first? Vida, you look like so Vida's going to speak first.
I want to tackle the provocative question on what happens if we have no user fees. Yes, I want to.
Does that work? Yeah.
I want to tackle the question about
Is it better?
what will happen if we have
Needs to
no
get
user
closer, I
fees.
think.
We need the cash to keep the system running. And usually we think that the poor might not be able to pay, because, and for that matter, any service is okay for them. I think people want service, and once you provide service, they'll be willing to pay. If you provide lousy services, they will not be willing to pay. What we see happening in Ghana is that in communities where the private sector has come in, providing reliable and quality service, communities are willing to even pay higher than what the usual fee is. Communities are spending money on buying sachet water, buying bottled water, because they don't trust the quality and the source of the water that we provide. So I think the emphasis should be first, let's look at providing good service. And once we provide good service, there will be willingness to pay. Yes, there might be genuine cases where there will be very deprived communities or isolated communities within a community that aren't able to pay. But we need to work out the mechanisms of allowing those who can pay to pay for the service, and then those who can genuinely not pay, see how we can support them. User fee, pay as you fetch is what we have promoted. But if you go to Ghana, in some of the communities, they've also found their own way of managing their user payment. I think we need to study these innovative, indigenous ways that have come up, communities going around, how they can get their systems running, and see how those can also be supported. So we don't just brush that aside and think the only option is pay as you fetch.
Thanks very much. Harold, would you like to tackle any of the questions?
Picking up on this question of preventative maintenance that you asked, Lewis. I mean, one comment, and I think it's a common challenge for us all, is a lack of sort of hard enough data, reliable enough data to really say anything about this in a meaningful way beyond case studies. And I think there's lots of examples where we can see some insights, but perhaps not the whole story. And I think, yeah, preventative maintenance is it can happen. There's I think a growing trend towards this sort of pay for service, which Adam mentioned. There are other examples in different countries. And that's picking up on also what Vida said in terms of paying for reliable service rather than contributing when something breaks down, which we know is problematic. In terms of the user fee question raised by Ellie, I think that really is something that I would push back on in terms of looking at the mix of different revenue sources. And I just don't see how, we know that there are problems with paying, and that's a reality, but I don't see how we could move forward to any kind of blend of financing that would help support services permanently without some element of user tariff. And there are examples of where we can increase user tariff at to reasonable levels through communication, through awareness raising, and they're putting in more emphasis and resources into that. So I would disagree that you should do away with tariffs. On the other hand, I think what we haven't talked about and nobody's raised yet is financial subsidy. And maybe it's an ideological position, but personally, I think somewhere along this value chain for rural water supply, you do need some kind of subsidy at some point. And if you talk to people in other sectors, like in urban sanitation, particularly for poorer people, I think that's also generally accepted that somewhere there has to be a subsidy. We look at the history of the services in our countries, in the North, in the US, still there's some form of subsidy somewhere along the line. And that is just the reality, because the pie is simply not big enough. That's for now.
Yes, all right, I will indulge you.
Yes.
And I'm going to come to Aaron.
Still on the user fee issue. Recently in Ghana, there was the TrackFin study, which looked at the various mix of funding for WASH in Ghana. And what the study found is that almost 60%, I have to look at the figures again, but about 60% of the funding for WASH delivery is coming from users. And when they reworked the maths, technically, development partners' contribution is about 6%. But if you look at only physical investment, you will say that development partners' contribution is 90%. So user fee is a big chunk of what it takes to keep the service running.
Okay, thanks very much. Aaron, I'm going to move to you and see if there are any of the questions we've had so far that you'd like to respond to.
Yes, one of course, I could also talk about user fees, but I think the bottom line is somebody must pay.
Mm.
And if you are in my position, because right now we are in budgeting, in our starting the budgeting cycle, we have rural water access at 67%. We have another 30 or so percent who have nothing. Now, what do? Do you put so much money into maintenance where there is even some little chance of getting a little cash from the people who are using, or you say let it remain at 67% and until probably we get oil, we expect oil. But so
that's going to change everything.
hopefully, but that's the question. And it has been a major question in our budgeting boardrooms. Where do you put your money? And it's related to donors only pay for hardware. It's really the same issue.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they put the money? I personally, I mean, in Uganda, I wouldn't push this to donors. Just say government, because for us, we sit together and we decide together where money should go. And the question has always been, do we put some money in capital maintenance? It's one of those things that we are trying to look at. The issue of subsidy, we're also looking at it, but we think we must leverage some funding from the communities as user fees. Now, on the issue of preventive maintenance, I think people must start thinking about this thing. Preventive maintenance is very, very important. In fact, it's key to having all these facilities working. But I don't want to agree that it is only failing because of community management. Look at cars. They are all in the private sector, even here in the US. Don't tell me that 100% of the cars are working, because they are not maintained. I mean, it's not community management. So I think there is more thinking supposed to go into this issue of preventive maintenance, because it is the only way we shall have the service as we want it. And I want to also to agree that we better look at the service. We have started a bit of that. Look at the service, let's fund the service, but let's look at all sources of financing.
Thanks. I think interesting what you're saying. Operation and maintenance is hard. It's hard no matter which model you use to do it. So we've got another question from the online audience, which is, what is the community's role in the transition from community-based management to professionally managed services, which I think is an interesting question. If we were thinking that what we need to do is to shift over to professional management, then sorry, who was?
Ellie.
Okay, thank you. Then what is the continuing role of the community? I mean, what I'm hearing say is that this is a problem you can slice a number of ways, and that community management might change and develop. So I think if we're looking into the future, what is the vision for the future with a role for the community? I know Jamie also had a question, and Ellie, I think, would like to say something. So perhaps what I'll do is I'll take your question very quickly, Jamie, and then I'll turn to Ellie to kick off.
Stand, because I think that the microphone.
Yeah, I would actually pick up the microphone.
It's this one I'm worried about.
Okay.
One of the things that concerns me is we focus so much on failure that we forget about success. And what we want is success. We don't want failure. A very quick story of some work we've done in 3 countries, sub-Saharan Africa, last few years, was to find systems that had been working for very long periods, decades, and try and find out what they had in common. One of the things we found directly addresses this tariff issue. We actually found a very weak association of long-term success with regular tariff collection. But what we did find is that successful long-term management was associated with committees that had ways to mobilize money. But tariffs were the rare part. Most of the time they raised them through community enterprise, mobilizing community assets. And those other mechanisms were far more inclusive and allowed all members of the community, whereas a monthly tariff in a rural economy can be quite exclusive. Second thing we learned is this simple notion that community management works or doesn't. There are certain community attributes which are necessary for it to work. And one of those is knowledge of and access to external support. So I think instead of labeling an approach as a failure, we need to understand where does it work properly, and it can only work properly where you both have the community committee working and also an external support that's accessible to it.
And I would add to that a comment that's also come in from somebody online, which is what ideas does the panel have on how to incentivize governments to fulfill their mandate and the role of the donors? And I think you made the interesting point that donors don't necessarily make all the decisions. They sit with government, who also helps guide the decisions. So how do we make all the incentives work in the right direction? So I'm going to go to Ellie first. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so Ellie, be extremely brief and succinct, please.
Okay, to respond to a few of these questions then, is there good evidence of preventive maintenance? No, I personally visited 338 water points. There was good evidence of greasing at 2 of them. That was it. I'm sort of here to oversimplify perhaps a little bit, but based on my own personal research, I would say that it is virtually unheard of for a water point to be dismantled just to check that it's working. People don't do that. They only take it apart when it is working, and there's a little bit of greasing from time to time. Do we understand what the default is when there are no user fees? Actually, again, in reality, there aren't really user fees. People do not pay regularly. If you ask them, do you pay regularly? They say, yes, we pay 50 kwacha every month. And then if you ask another 10 follow-up questions about finance, you find that that is basically not the case at all. If you collect data from managers, as I did from 86 water point managers, specific data on exactly what finances they have, you find that I think 11 out of the 86 had enough money to buy 1 replacement rod. That was it. So there isn't a kind of just in case collection of user fees. They don't exist in reality. What happens in reality is conflicts collecting money when a water point actually breaks down. There's people have to sort of scrabble together, find their own ways to collect the money. Picking up on Jamie's point about community enterprise, I found only 1 case of that, and that was a failed collective tomato garden. Based on my wider experience, I don't think that collective enterprises to pay for water point maintenance work. It's much simpler just to collect the money. And the reality is this is about a collective action problem. So it's difficult to get everybody to get the money together. It's easier to either wait for the external agency or to call on the big man, you know, the person who's got access to resources to assist. Theft is an important part in some places of ensuring continuing water point maintenance in other locations. Theft is something we don't talk about enough within the sector as a cause of water point failure. And, you know, I found water points where they were broken down. People were saying, we don't have money to pay for clean water, but they were drunk. So, you know, it's an issue where it's hard to get the money together, get the collective action. And that is why there's much more of a role that needs to be played by government and by donors, by actors who have the capacity to manage the system more widely.
Thank you very much. Okay, Harold, I think you had something to say on the question of incentives and human rights.
Yeah, picking up because Sean, we didn't forget your question, or I didn't forget your question anyway, on whether or not it's a mechanism for addressing human rights. I think it's probably not the ideal mechanism in my opinion. What's more important is to work with governments as the final duty bearers, national and local governments, and engage with them. And that's easier in some countries than others, but it is fundamentally what Vida was alluding to earlier from the case of Ghana, is that there is, for community management to succeed, there is a role that government should be playing and other actors should be playing, and it's right to hold government to account to say, look, you've got to do more, you've got to step up and spend more money, although we know that's also a difficult ask. So I think that's one way of trying to incentivize and meet that obligation to human right to water. But I think one thing we all miss, because most of us are not economists, I'm certainly not, but I think we've failed in the long term to really make a case that these are huge, valuable assets for the country. It's patrimony of each country, these systems that are sitting there in the ground, often deteriorating because of lack of proper asset management. So if we can start to flip the argument and say, look guys, you've got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets and they're going down the drain. That's one way of speaking, I think, to governments and trying to incentivize them to take that side more seriously.
Aaron, obviously this is something for you to respond to. Is that how do you feel when Harold makes that statement that governments have to step up? Well,
it's a good statement. I sometimes say it's a good problem. One thing about government, I work for government, but there are so many layers above me. Where funds are concerned, there are others that make the decisions. Now, when I hear this coming from such a conference, to me it's okay, because one of the things I talk about is advocacy. And when you have some voices talking about funding and getting funding in O&M, to me, that's okay. So incentivized governments, yeah, we are looking at conferences like this and voices from such places. And I want to add this, that such voices, governments will only take them when they are well researched. They shouldn't be just ideas. So let them be well researched with a lot of evidence, and then we have, and such information gets access to the decision makers, then I think we shall be good to go. Just a comment about funds collection and where the funds should come from. I think there's been the notion that in community management, it should be the communities only to collect the funds. I think we are trying out some models whereby we are looking at funds collection and management as almost a project. I mean, funds can come from visitors. Adam can come to my community and contribute some money. As long as that money is managed well, kept well, and used well, to me that's okay. I mean, if it's a politician, let's have funds management and funds collection as an issue and look at it.
So do you mean take some of the issue of the management of those funds away from user committees, professionalize that? Would you have that done by a separate entity?
I actually am very careful about taking certain roles away. Okay, professionalizing. Professionalizing costs money. And these are little monies, and you bring in an accountant or a good professional, he'll take all this money. What I'm looking at is people should think of empowering these communities to make sure they manage this money. One thing, I mean, which you are trying out, just the community to have a bank account. It sounds obvious to maybe most of the people in this room, but in Uganda, for the communities in rural areas to have a bank account is something. And if I could get the 100,000 communities with the 100,000 boreholes in Uganda having bank accounts,
you feel that would improve?
I'll be several steps and several miles ahead. Because
I think what we're hearing is that one of the most divisive issues is the management of money. That's certainly what I hear coming along.
It has never been easy.
It's never been easy. It's never been easy. We've only got a few minutes left. Vida, did you want to come in? You haven't had a chance to have a kick at some of these questions that are on the table. Do you want to talk a bit about incentives?
Yes, on incentivizing government, I think that it begins with us clarifying the accountability measures. And that would require also reviewing mandates of government institutions that have been established. Most of the government institutions that we have in Ghana, like the Community Water and Sanitation Agency, has been defined and modeled around the COM. And so sometimes they may want to take certain actions, but they feel constrained. And so there will be need for us, we discuss the model, we should also be looking at the institutional arrangements that we have in place for its delivery and ensuring that the accountability measures are clearly defined. We've had instances where from the community level to the policy level to parliament, system breaks down, letters are written from one point to the other and ends up in the community because you can't really put a finger on who is actually responsible to fix the issue. And therefore, without clear accountability measures, it becomes very difficult to talk about incentives because people would always shift the blame and eventually we bring it back to their communities. But I think as practitioners, we should also look at our own role and ensure that we support these communities for things to work.
All right, thank you very much. We're almost at the half hour here and people are getting antsy because they've got to get to the sessions that start at 8:30. Our online audience has been with us all along, but I'm sure they're also ready to wrap up. I found this a very interesting conversation, certainly one that I hope that we can continue. I hear clear things, clear messages coming out that there are roles not only for users in management but also for government, that there has to be clear lines of accountability, that there are definite implications for development agencies in the way that they fund and support rural water supply, that we have to look at a broad range of options, that we can't just have sort of one size fits all, and that as usual, and this always ends every session at the UNC conference, we need more evidence and we need more research. And that's why we're all here. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much to the panelists and thank you to the online audience for excellent questions and participation. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the WASH Policy Digest. We've got lots of copies of them here. They're free if you want to get a subscription.